The alien queen believes she married a humble man until she saw him in action. The pen was still warm when I signed my name at the bottom of a document that was 47 pages long, written in 3 languages, and apparently also served as a marriage contract. Nobody told me about that last part until the translator beat in my ear caught up with the ceremonial closing paragraph. By then the ink was dry, and the entire Solarian diplomatic delegation had already pressed their clan marks into the wax seals with what I can only describe as cheerful finality. I looked at the woman sitting across the table from me, 8 ft tall, shoulders armored, natural chitin the color of a thundercloud, 4 fingers on each hand, and each one capable of bending steel. And I said, as calmly as I could manage, "Did your legal team perhaps bury a clause in there?" Her iridescent eyes moved to me. They were large, slightly compound in structure, and they caught light the way oil on water does. She studied me for a moment with the patient expression of a creature that has won every room it has ever entered. "The consort clause," she said in accented but precise English, "has been standard in Solarian state treaties for 900 years. Your diplomatic office was given the full document in advance." They absolutely were, I agreed, and I would bet my pension that no one read past page 12. Her name was Viara, Queen of the Solarian Dominion, Supreme Commander of its 11 fleet divisions, holder of 3 clan marks earned in actual combat, rather than inherited, and according to a document I had just signed my wife. My name is Darren Cole. I am 43 years old. I have gray at my temples, a scar along my left jawline from a situation in a country I am still not technically allowed to name, and a slightly uneven walk from a piece of shrapnel that a field surgeon removed in the dark using a headlamp and a great deal of hope. I had been working as a xeno-diplomacy consultant for the Interstellar Compact for 2 years at that point, mostly because it turned out that a career spent learning how people behave under extreme pressure translated reasonably well to learning how alien species behave under moderate inconvenience. I was good at reading rooms. I was good at staying quiet. I was good at noticing things. What I was not, by any visible standard, was impressive. The Solvari court certainly did not think so. I could tell from the moment we arrived at the Dominion's capital station, a structure so large it generated its own gravity and its own weather patterns in the upper corridors. The court attendants who met our delegation at the docking ring were polite in the way that very powerful people are polite too, something they find slightly pitiful. They measured me with their eyes, all of them tall, all of them armored in the natural plating that Solvari developed over millennia, all of them carrying themselves like creatures who had never once been prey, and I watched their antennae make small, involuntary movements that my translation guide had flagged as the equivalent of a suppressed laugh. One of the senior attendants, a male named Jorith, who had the kind of posture that suggested he had been parade standing since childhood, leaned toward a colleague and said something at a frequency he presumably thought was below human hearing range. My translation bead caught it anyway. "The soft one," he said. "They sent her the soft one." I did not react. I had spent a significant portion of my adult life being underestimated, and I had long ago made peace with the fact that it was, in almost every measurable way, An advantage, the wedding ceremony happened the following morning in a hall with ceilings so high they vanished into an engineered fog that glowed faintly blue. There were approximately 300 Silverian attendants ranging from court officials in ceremonial armor to fleet admirals who looked like they had come directly from a battle briefing and expected to return to one. The hall smelled of something mineral and sharp, like ozone and heated stone. A low harmonic tone moved through the floor at all times, a Silvari tradition, I had been told, meant to resonate with the chest cavity and remind everyone present of the gravity of the occasion. I stood at the ceremonial dais in a dark suit that my compact liaison had assured me was appropriate, holding a small metal rod that served as the Silvari equivalent of a wedding ring, a conductivity token exchanged between parties to signify that their life signals were now formally linked in the diplomatic record. Vayara stood across from me, taller by more than 2 ft in armor that had been ceremonially polished to a mirror finish. She looked like something carved from the idea of authority. The hall was perfectly silent. The officiating elder spoke in Old Silvari, which my translation bead rendered into English with a slight delay, so I was always half a sentence behind. At some point the elder said something that caused a ripple of movement through the audience, a shift in posture, a clicking of mandibles, the Silvari equivalent of murmuring. I glanced around and caught Jorith's expression. He was not suppressing a laugh this time. He was studying me with something closer to curiosity. I leaned slightly toward the compact liaison who was standing 3 steps to my left. What did the elder just say? I asked quietly. The liaison, a young woman named Clara, who had the permanent expression of someone managing a very complicated spreadsheet, whispered back without moving her lips that in the history of the Dominion, no consort has ever stood in this hall without demonstrating a combat lineage. You are the first exception in 900 years. Wonderful, I said. And the crowd reaction? They are trying to decide, she said, whether that is funny or interesting. Let them wonder, I said. Vayara, who was close enough to have heard all of this, did not react, but her eyes moved to me for just a fraction of a second, and in that fraction I caught something I had not expected. Not pity, not amusement. Calculation. The token exchange happened without ceremony from my side of the dais. I took hers, she took mine, and the hall exhaled in a collective resonance that made the floor vibrate. It was done. Dispersed into a reception that involved food I could not eat, beverages I was advised strongly against, and a great deal of clicking conversation that my translation bead processed in overlapping fragments. I found a quiet corner near a viewport and stood there with a glass of water, watching the stars. The capital station was in orbit around a gas giant with rings so dense they looked solid from this distance, amber and rust-colored. Impossibly beautiful. I had been to 11 worlds since joining the Compact's diplomatic corps. Not one of them had stopped surprising me. You are not socializing. I turned. Vayara had crossed the room without a sound, which was a remarkable achievement for someone wearing plated armor. She was looking at the viewport, not at me. I don't speak Silvari well enough to socialize yet, I said. I'm working on it. You have been working on it for how long? 3 weeks. She was quiet for a moment. Our children begin formal language. Acquisition at 8 years of age. It requires 2 standard years to achieve. Basic fluency. I learn faster under pressure. I said, I always have. She turned her head to look at me. The light from the gas giant caught the edge of her jaw plating and turned it gold. You are not afraid, she said. It was not a compliment, it was an observation made with the precision of someone cataloging an anomaly. Should I be? Every consort before you has been afraid on this day. It is an expected response to this environment. I've been in harder rooms, I said. She studied me for another moment. Then she said, with the careful neutrality of someone choosing their words deliberately, you are my consort. You will attend state functions. You will be presentable and quiet. I expect nothing beyond that from you. Understood, I said. Good. She turned to return to the reception. I let 2 full seconds pass. Do you play chess? She stopped, did not turn. I do not know what chess is. It's a game, I said. 2 players, 64 squares, 16 pieces per side. The goal is to corner the opponent's most important piece without them seeing it coming until it's too late. There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough for me to know she was genuinely thinking about it. And you play this game well? She asked. Well enough, I said. She left without answering, but she did not say no. Back in the quarters the station had assigned to us large, climate-controlled to a temperature that was comfortable for her and slightly warm for me. I unpacked the one personal item I had brought from Earth that was not clothing or equipment, a wooden chess set, hand carved, pieces worn smooth from years of use. I set it on the low table near the viewport and left it there. When I came back from the washroom 20 minutes later, Vayara was standing over it with the stillness of someone trying to understand something without asking for help. She was looking at the pieces with her head tilted at a very slight angle, the way a person looks at a puzzle they have already begun solving. She did not acknowledge that I had come back into the room. I sat down on my side of the board, picked up the white king and set it back down. The object of the game, I said, is not to destroy the other player's pieces. It is to control the space around their king until they have no move left that doesn't end badly. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she sat down. 3 weeks into living on the Solvari capital station, I had made exactly one friend, learned enough of the language to follow a conversation at roughly half speed, and discovered that the food dispensary 2 corridors down from our quarters produced something that was almost indistinguishable from coffee if you asked for the darkest available roast from the Keth world grain menu. The friend was Kreth. He was Vayara's senior general, commander of the Dominion's 3rd Fleet Division, responsible for the defense of 8 border systems, and physically the most intimidating creature I had personally shared a table with in 43 years. He stood 69 in his bare feet, which was compact for a Solvari male, but his shoulders were broad enough that he had to turn sideways to pass through doorways designed for humans. His face bore 3 dueling scars along the jaw, earned, not ceremonial, and he had the habit of watching everyone in a room simultaneously, the way soldiers do when the habit has become so deep it no longer requires conscious effort. He had come to find me on day 4 of my residence on the station, not with aggression, not with official purpose. He had simply appeared in the corridor outside my quarters at a time when I was standing there with my almost coffee, looking out a viewport at the planet below, and he had said in careful English, "You move like someone who has been in closed spaces." I looked at him. He was watching me with the flat, measuring attention of a man making an assessment he intended to act on if the answer was wrong. "I've been in a few," I said. He nodded once slowly. "I watched you walk the docking ring on arrival day. You checked exits. You noted our sidearms. You put yourself between the diplomat woman in the crowd twice without making it look deliberate." I sipped my almost coffee. "Old habits." "What kind of habits?" "The kind you develop when the job description includes a clause about not coming home in a box." He was quiet for a moment, then he made a sound deep in his chest, a low, resonant click that my translation bead flagged as something between respect and amusement. "The court calls you the soft one," he said. "I know they are wrong," he said. "I know that too." He asked after a pause if I was interested in a sparring demonstration the following morning. Not participation. He made that clear with a faint glance at my leg. Just observation. His junior officers trained at first light, and he thought I might find it interesting. I found it very interesting, not because it was impressive, though it was. The Silvari fought with a combination of natural plating, trained leverage, and reflexes that made human martial arts look like slow dancing. What interested me was what they were not doing. There were gaps in their close quarters patterns, predictable rhythms. They trained against each other, which meant they trained against an opponent of known size, known strength, and known fighting style. They had never, as far as I could tell, trained against something that didn't look like them. I said nothing about this. I watched and I filed it away, and I said, "Your juniors are very good." Kreth looked at me sideways. But I said, "They're very good." He made the sound again, the respect amusement click. We had been sharing a table at the morning meal at least twice a week ever since. Vayara, meanwhile, had agreed, without quite admitting it was an agreement, to a second chess lesson, then a third. She's learned the game at a pace that was genuinely alarming. By the second session, she had stopped asking why pieces moved the way they did, and started asking why I made the choices I made, not the rules, the reasoning. She wanted to understand not the mechanics of the game, but the mind of the player. She won her first game against me in week 3. I was not letting her win. I want to be absolutely clear about that. She earned it. She had been setting up trap for 11 moves, and I had been focused on a threat that turned out to be a decoy. When I finally saw the real attack, it was 4 moves too late. She moved her bishop and then looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, part satisfaction, part something that looked almost like relief, as if she had been waiting to confirm something she suspected. "You were not expecting that," she said. "I was not," I admitted. "You missed it because you were watching the wrong piece. You set up the decoy very well. You taught me that the decoy is sometimes more important than the piece you intend to move." She paused. "I have been thinking about that principle outside this game." I did not ask her what she meant. I had learned early that with Vayara, the moment you pushed a conversation, it closed. The moment you left it open, it continued on its own terms. "Rematch," I said. "Tomorrow," she said. And then, after a pause that carried weight, "Stay for the evening briefing. The Morkai situation has developed. It was the first time she had invited me to anything official. The briefing room was large, circular, with a holographic map of the border corridor suspended in the center. 6 of Vayara's senior advisors were already present, along with 2 fleet commanders and the Dominion's chief intelligence officer, a lean, quiet Salvani female named Sithara, who had the eyes of someone who has read every file in existence and forgotten nothing. They acknowledged my presence with the careful neutrality of people who had been told to accept it and were still deciding how they felt. The situation, as it was explained, involved the Morkai Collective, a mid-tier civilization with 4 inhabited systems and a history of aggressive border negotiation. They had been interrupting trade convoys in a corridor that technically fell inside Dominion claimed space. 3 incidents in 6 weeks. No shots fired yet, but the interruptions were becoming more frequent, and the Morkai's demands, presented through diplomatic channels as cracks for transit fee acknowledgement, were becoming more specific. Vayara's advisors were unanimous. This was a posture play. The Morkai were testing boundaries. The response should be a fleet movement, not an attack, but a visible repositioning of 2 divisions close enough to the corridor to make the calculation obvious. I sat in the back. I had not been given a seat at the main table, which was fine. I had a good view of everything from where I was. The advisors presented their case. It was logical, coherent, and almost certainly wrong. I waited until they finished. Then I waited another 10 seconds to make sure they were actually finished. Vayara's eyes moved to me. You have something, she said. It was not a question. The Morkai have never disputed a trade corridor before, I said. They've had every opportunity to do so. They share a border with 4 other civilizations, and they have never been the ones to start a boundary dispute. There is a first time, one of the advisors said. There is, I agreed. But look at the timing. All 3 incidents happened within 2 standard weeks of the Compact's announcement of the new resource sharing framework. The framework that, if it passes, adjusts transit fee structures across 9 corridors, including 2 that the Morkai use for their primary exports. The room was quiet. They are not testing boundaries, I said. They are scared. They think the new framework is going to cost them access to corridors they depend on, and nobody has told them directly that it won't. They are making noise because they don't have another tool available. Sithara, the intelligence officer, had gone very still. If a fleet moves into that corridor, I continued, it confirms their worst assumption that the Dominion intends to use the framework as a pretext for control. You will not stop 3 incidents. You will cause the next 50. The silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Vayara's voice, when it came, was level and uninflected. What would you do instead? Send them the relevant section of the framework document with a direct note from your office confirming that Morkai transit corridors are not subject to the new structure. Then invite their senior delegate for a formal consultation. Visit, give them something to point to at home when their own hardliners ask why they backed down. One of the fleet commanders made a dismissive sound. Vayara held up one hand and he went silent. She looked at the map for a long moment. Then she looked at me. Prepare a draft, she said. It was not praise, it was a directive. But in that room with those People watching, it was something I had not been in this place since I arrived. It was taken seriously. I walked back to our quarters that night through corridors that were quieter now, the station moving into its dark cycle, the low harmonic tone in the floor fading too. Something barely felt. I made my almost coffee and stood at the viewport for a while, watching the amber rings of the planet below turn slowly in the dark. The door opened behind me. Viara came in, still in the lighter armor she wore for station duty, and crossed to the viewport without speaking. She stood there for a moment, looking at the same view. The draft, she said finally. How long will it take you? 2 hours, I said. Maybe 3 if I want the framing right. Get the framing right, she said. I will. She was quiet again. Outside the viewport, the rings turned. A transport ship moved through the dark at the edge of sight, its running lights blinking slow and steady. You said something in the briefing, she said, about giving them something to point to at home. Yes. You were not thinking about the Morokai. When you said that, she said, you were thinking about something else. I looked at her. Her eyes were on the viewport. Her jaw was set in a way I had come to recognize over the past 3 weeks. Not tension, but concentration. I was thinking, I said carefully, that every leader who needs to change course needs a reason that their people can accept, even if the real reason is that they were wrong. Especially then, she said. Nothing for a long while, then quietly. You have done this before, giving people a way to change course without losing face, more times than I can count, I said. She turned from the viewport and walked toward the back of the room, toward the door that led to her private chamber. She stopped in the frame. There is a reception tomorrow evening, she said, for the compact liaison team. You will attend. Of course, I said. Stand next to me, she said. Not 3 steps behind. She went through the door. I stood at the viewport a little longer, looking at the rings, the running lights, the deep, impatient dark between the stars. I was beginning to think that this assignment was going to be considerably more interesting than anyone at the compact had anticipated. I made a second cup of almost coffee and started on the draft. The planet was called Veth Aaron in Saul Vari, which translated roughly to the Old Crossing, a border world inhabited, but not heavily, sitting at the junction of 3 transit corridors that had been disputed, settled, disputed again, and finally folded into Dominion-controlled space about 40 years before my birth. It had low gravity, a pale yellow sky, and towns built into the sides of cliffs that were spectacular to look at, and as it turned out, extremely difficult to secure. I had told Clara, our liaison, that I thought the location for the state visit was suboptimal. She had relayed that concern to the scheduling office. The scheduling office had relayed back that the visit to Vethoran was symbolically significant. It would be the first time a Dominion queen had set foot on the planet in 2 generations, and the local council had been planning the reception for 4 months. I had said understood, and then I had spent the 2-day transit reviewing everything I could find about the terrain, the transit corridors nearby, the political affiliations of every notable group within reach of the planet, and the identities of 3 separatist factions that had been operating in the border region for the past decade. Kreth found me doing this on the 2nd day of transit, sitting in my cabin with a data tablet in one hand and the cold dregs of a genuine coffee. Supply officer had traded me from her. Personal reserve, he looked at the tablet then at me. You think there is a threat assessment problem, he said. I think the security plan is designed for a ceremonial visit on a stable. World, I said, this isn't a stable. World, he was quiet for a moment. I will review the plan with my officers. I'd appreciate that, he looked at me. For a second longer than necessary. You have done threat assessments before. Different name for it where I come from, I said, but yes, he left. Without further comment, 2 hours later, I heard through the ship's intercom that the security configuration for the surface visit had been adjusted. 2 additional positions added, perimeter spacing increased, response protocols updated. It was not enough, but it was better. We landed in the early morning. By local time, the sky was the color of old paper, the air thin and carrying a mineral smell that caught at the back of the throat. The town built into the cliffsides rose above us in layers. Architecture that had been carved directly from pale stone over centuries. Walkways and bridges connecting levels. Like sentences in a very long book. Local council had set up a reception area at the base of the cliffs, an open plaza ceremonially paved with banners. Dominion colors hanging from poles. It was a beautiful morning, I noted, for positions with elevation advantage. 3 narrow approach corridors that would funnel any crowd, intended or otherwise. 2 points where the plaza sightlines collapsed into blind spots. I noted these things the way other people note the weather, automatically, without drama. The reception proceeded. Vera spoke to the local council, received their formal acknowledgement of Dominion authority, and then moved through a greeting line that took 40 minutes and involved a great deal of Silvari formal gesturing that I had by then learned to approximate, though my version of it apparently still looked slightly wrong, in a way that Kreth had described as like watching someone do something correct with the wrong amount of confidence. I was standing 4 steps to Vera's left, not 3 steps behind, not since she had told me to stand closer at the compact reception. Her 2 personal guards were ahead and behind. Kreth was at the edge of the plaza, watching everything the way he always watched everything. It was the personal guards who went down first. There was no warning sound, no announcement, just a sharp pulse of something in the air, a pressure change, the kind that happens when a localized EMP field activates. And then both guards were on the ground. Their armor's electronic systems collapsed, their communication links dead. The banners around the plaza went still as the small embedded sound systems in their poles cut out. Simultaneously, 12 figures came through the 2 approach corridors at the same moment. They were armored, not Silvari armored, but in hardened composite plate, helmets down, moving in a pattern that told me 3 things in the first 2 seconds. They had trained for this specific approach. They had assigned fields of fire, and they were not expecting significant resistance from the plaza because the target was a diplomatic function with soft security. Veyara moved into a combat stance immediately, completely automatic, and I registered that she was wearing the light ceremonial plating she used for surface visits rather than her full armor, which meant her coverage was reduced by approximately 40%. I had no weapon, I had no armor. I was wearing a dark jacket over a simple shirt, and I was holding a ceramic mug that still had about an inch of almost coffee in it. I had a cane in my left hand, which I used. For uneven terrain, it was a solid piece of work. I had specifically chosen one with an aluminum core because I am not an optimist, but I am a planner. I had the plaza lay out in my head from the 40 minutes I had spent standing in it, and I had approximately 11 years of training, 7 years of operational experience, and a specific gift for calculating the distance between and the time it takes to close it. The first two came through the northern corridor in a wedge, the lead figure slightly ahead. I was already moving by the time they cleared the entrance, not toward them, but to their left into the blind spot I had noted earlier, the one where the cliff wall met the plaza paving at an angle that created a 3ft shadow. I was inside that shadow before they finished their first sweep of the plaza. The lead figure had a slight hitch in his step, right knee, and he was favoring his left side, which meant the right flank was slower to react. I came out of the shadow at a low angle and put the cane across the back of his right knee in a precise, controlled strike that dropped him without making him unconscious. He needed to be able to talk later. He hit the paving, and I stepped past him using the mug. The ceramic caught the second figure across the temple at the exact angle needed to produce a result that was conclusive but not permanent, and then I had the first figure's dropped weapon in my hand and was already placing myself between the eastern corridor figures and Vayara's position. I talked myself through it quietly as I moved, which was a habit so old I barely noticed it anymore. The way you narrate a chess problem, this one has 2 steps before his partner, so I have that gap. This one keeps his weight forward, which means he commits before he sees the counter. This one is watching Vayara instead of the plaza floor, which means he will not see the change in my angle until it is already 3 moves past the point where it matters. The whole thing lasted about 4 minutes, not 4 minutes of constant engagement, 4 minutes in which I moved through a space, addressed each problem as it presented itself, and used every environmental advantage I had identified that morning. The elevation change at the western end of the plaza, the narrowness of the southern corridor exit, which meant the figures there had to come through single file if they did not want to interfere with each other. The way the morning light at that hour came from behind me and directly into the eyes of anyone facing me from the east. I was breathing harder than usual. When it was done, my knee ached in the specific way it always ached after sustained movement on low gravity terrain. I had a cut above my left eye from a piece of plaza paving that had cracked under one of the figures when they went down, and a fragment had come up at a bad angle. It was not deep. It was bleeding with more enthusiasm than the situation warranted. I found my cane, which had ended up about 8 ft away. I straightened my jacket. 11 figures were on the ground or restrained against the cliff face. 1, the lead figure from the northern corridor, the one with the knee, was sitting against the paving with his hands secured behind him using a length of banner cord that had come down during the initial pulse, looking at me with an expression that I could not interpret through his helmet's visor, but that I suspected was something close to confusion. The 12th figure had not made it into the plaza. Kreth had dealt with that one personally at the entrance to the northern corridor in a manner that I had not witnessed, but that produced a sound I recognized. I walked back across the plaza toward Viara, she was standing exactly where she had been when the pulse hit. She had not moved. Her combat stance had not relaxed. Her eyes tracked me the entire way across the plaza, the way they tracked everything with that precise, cataloging attention that I had seen in briefing rooms and chess games and late night conversations at the viewport. I stopped 2 feet in front of her. Are you injured? I asked. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking. No, she said. Good, I said. The one against the north wall can talk. We'll want to speak with him before the compact security team arrives, she said. Nothing. I pressed 2 fingers against the cut above my eye, which had made a small red contribution to my jacket collar. There is probably a medic in the council building, I said. I don't think this needs much, but I would rather not bleed on the official record. She was still looking at me with that expression I could not read. It was not the calculation I had seen at the wedding days, and it was not the quiet attention I had seen over the chessboard. It was something else, something that sat at the edge of a category I was not sure she had used before. Darren, she said. It was the first time she had used my name without the formal Silvari title prefix. Yes, it was a simple question, 4 words, but the way she asked it with the controlled precision of someone who suspects is going to rearrange something important made it land the way a good chess move lands, not loud, just suddenly, completely clear. I looked at the plaza around us. 12 figures, a cracked paving stone, my cane in my hand in the cold morning air of a border world at the edge of known space. Right now, I said, I'm the one who noticed the blind spots. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then she turned and walked toward the council building to find the medic. I followed, keeping pace with my uneven step, thinking about what the person against the north wall was going to tell us, and whether that would be the beginning of a problem or the end of one. It turned out to be the beginning. The security footage from Veth Aaron was reviewed by Kreth and Sethara separately without coordination, and they arrived at the same conclusion independently within 4 hours of each other. Kreth came to tell me in person. He stood in the doorway of the station medical bay where a very calm Solari physician was closing the cut above my eye with a ceiling compound that felt cold and smelled faintly of pine, and he said without preamble, "You held back." I needed one of them to talk, I said. Not because of that. I looked at him. The pattern, he said, your movements. You held a margin the entire time. There was more available to you. You did not use it. I said nothing. He stood there for a moment with his arms crossed and his scarred jaw set in a way I had come to recognize as Kreth, processing something he was not entirely comfortable with. I have been watching humans in the compact for 7 years, he said. I have read your species classification files. I have studied the assessments. None of them said this. Nobody asked the right questions. I said, what are the right questions? The physician finished the ceiling compound and stepped back. I sat up, carefully touching the edge of the repair with one finger. Clean work. How long have you been at war? I said. Not a specific war, not a conflict, with a start date and an end date. How long has your species existed in a state where survival required fighting? Kreth was quiet. For humans, I said, the answer is 100,000 years, maybe more. There was no period in our history when we were not prey to something or competing with something or fighting each other over resources or territory. Or ideas, we were never the biggest. Animal, we were never the strongest. We survived because we learned faster than anything else on our planet how to think about a threat before it reached us. I looked at him. The assessments say we are physically inferior, that is. Correct, the assessments say we are emotionally volatile, that is. Sometimes correct, what the assessments don't say is that we have been training for this specific situation, outmatched, outweighed in a dangerous environment, since before we had written language. Kreth looked at me for a long time. The court still calls you the soft one, he said. I know, they will stop, he said. It was not a prediction, it was a decision. I nodded and stood up. Carefully, my knee complained about the low gravity as it always did. I found my cane, took 3 steps to confirm the cut wasn't affecting my peripheral vision, and then went to find Sathara. Because the person from the north wall had apparently started talking and was saying things that were considerably more significant than an isolated separatist action. Sathara was in the station intelligence suite, surrounded by data displays that she was reading with a focused calm of someone for whom alarming information is simply information. She looked up when I came in, assessed the sealed cut, and said the northern faction received funding and operational support from an outside source. The source is not domestic. She paused. How do you know that? I don't, I said, but the attack was too coordinated for a regional faction. The EMP technology is not available locally, and the Gulf Rec have been watching the compact's expansion with concern for approximately 2 years, which is also how long humans have been compact members. They expected the Salvari response to the Morokai situation to be a fleet movement that fractured the compact's political trust. When it wasn't, someone made a different decision. Sathara looked at me for a moment, then she looked at her displays, then back at me. You worked this out. Before we extracted the testimony, I worked out a probability before we landed. I said, the testimony confirmed it, and you said nothing. I had no proof. I had a shape. I sat down across from her, which she allowed. Without comment, I noticed that the small moment of permission, the shifting of what was acceptable. What did the testimony give you specifically? What it gave us over the next 6 hours was a picture that was detailed, troubling, and from a strategic standpoint, potentially very useful. The Galthrak had been running a slow burn destabilization operation across several of the compact's newer member civilizations. Not war, not direct confrontation, something more patient and more expensive, quietly backing domestic fault lines, funding factions that already existed, providing capabilities just beyond local manufacturing to groups that already had grievances. The goal was not to conquer. The goal was to make the compact's newest members feel ungovernable, to erode the confidence of established members in the value of expansion, and to wait for the structure to begin pulling itself apart from the inside. The attack on Vetheran was not an assassination attempt, Sathara concluded. It was a demonstration, intended to be visible, intended to be attributed eventually to local separatists without external fingerprints, intended to prompt a Dominion crackdown on the border world that would alienate the local population and hand the Galthrak a narrative. They expected a military response, I said. Yes, Sathara said, they still expect One, they are counting on it. I looked at the display showing the border corridor, the same map I had first seen in the Dominion briefing room weeks ago, the night I had suggested writing a note to the Morkai instead of moving a fleet. If the Dominion moves forces onto Vetheran, invisible numbers, what happens to the local councils? Relationship with the population? Sathara's expression told me she had already followed this line to its end and did not enjoy the destination. It becomes complicated, she said carefully. It becomes a story that the Galthrak can point to. I said, they don't need to win. They just need enough evidence to build the narrative that the Dominion uses its members the way an owner uses property. That narrative spreads. The Compact's other newer members start asking whether their membership is protection or occupation, and so we do nothing, Esthara said in the tone of someone testing an argument. Not nothing, I said, something they can't model. She looked at me. The Galthric know how the Dominion responds to military threats, I said. They have 900 years of data. They know how every major civilization in the Compact responds to military threats because military threats are the only threats those civilizations recognize. What they do not know how to model is a response that is not military. I paused. They have been watching humans for 2 years. They think they know what we are. They categorized us the same way the Dominion did: small, soft, emotionally volatile, technologically behind. What they have not considered is that we have been doing this, the non-military kind of winning, for a very long time. Esthara was quiet for a long moment. Then, since she said, you will need to explain this to the Queen. I know, I said. She will have questions. I expect so. Esthara looked at me with her flat, reading eyes. She has been asking questions about you since the morning of the visit, she said. Not security questions, different ones. I did not respond to that. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and said, can you arrange a private meeting for this evening? Just her, you, Kreth, if he's available, and me. Esthara arranged it. The meeting was not in the briefing room. It was in Viara's private working chamber, a room I had not been in before, smaller than I expected, with one wide viewport showing the gas giant and its rings, a long desk covered in documents and data tablets, and a single chessboard on a side table that I recognized because it was mine. She had moved it here at some point. I did not comment on this. Viara was standing at the viewport when I came in. Esthara and Kreth were already present, standing on opposite sides of the room with the particular quality of attention that people have when they are waiting for something important. I set down my data tablet and took the chair at the end of the desk that had been left open. Not the foot of the table, not the head of it, but the side closest to the door, which was where I naturally put myself. Viara did not turn from the viewport for a long moment. Then she said without moving, tell me what you are. It was the same question she had asked in the plaza, but here it carried a different weight. There was no blood on the paving stones here, no ambient urgency. It was a quiet room, a closed door, and a question being asked by someone who had been thinking about it for approximately 14 hours and had decided that she deserved a real answer. I told her not the edited version, not the diplomatic consultants resumed, that my compact file led with the real version from the beginning. The enlistment at 18, the years of infantry, the selection process which I will not describe in detail but which remains the hardest thing I have ever voluntarily done. Years after that, operating in places with names that I said quietly and that Sithara, I noticed, was committing to memory, the training pipelines, afterward teaching the next generation of people who do what I used to do, because my knee had an opinion about extended field operations that I had eventually chosen to respect the transition eventually to the kind of work that used the analytical part of the training rather than the physical, because I turned out to be very good at understanding how people behave when they believe no one is watching them. I told her that I was not exception among humans, that I was, by the standards of the specific community I came from, middling. I knew men and women who were better shooters, faster movers, sharper analysts, people who had operated in conditions that made my history look comfortable. I had been good enough. I had been consistent. I had been the kind of person that particular work tends to preserve, which is not the best, but the most adaptable. I told her that the Compact Zine Diplomacy Division had recruited me not because of the operational background, specifically, though they found it useful, but because I had demonstrated an ability to read unfamiliar cultures quickly, to find the underlying logic and behaviors that looked irrational from the outside, and to sit in a room with people who were larger, more powerful, and more dangerous than me, without becoming either aggressive or afraid. When I finished, the room was quiet. Kreth was looking at the floor with the expression of someone recalculating. Sithara was looking at the data tablet in her hands with the expression of someone who has already moved on to what this means. Operationally, Viara turned from the viewport. She looked at me with those compound eyes that caught light like oil on water, and I could see her working through it, the whole of it, the weight of it, with the same methodical precision she brought to a chessboard in the late stages of a close game. You told them, she said, when you were assigned to this mission, you told the Compact what you were. It's in my file, I said. Service record, operational history, evaluation summaries, all of it. I submitted it as required, and no one read it. No one read past the part that said Xenodiplomacy Consultant, I said, which honestly tells you something about institutional attention to detail. Across species lines, she was quiet for a moment. You are not the exception, she said. You said that clearly. You are middling by your own people's standards. Then there are humans walking through diplomatic corridors across the Compact, on stations, on worlds, in meetings, who are better than you, considerably, I said, though I imagine most of them are not currently wearing the consort mark of a Sylvari queen, so perhaps the specific combination of credentials has not come up before. Something moved in her expression. It was brief and controlled, and I had enough practice reading her by then to identify it, the suppressed edge of something that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. You understand what this information means, she said. It was not a question. I understand what it means for how the Dominion may want to reconsider its assessment of its Compact partners. Yes, I said, and I understand what it means for the Galthrax situation, which is the more immediate question. She moved to the desk and sat down, not the Queen's posture, the working posture, the one she used when she was actually thinking. Rather than presiding, she looked at the data tablet I had left on the desk. Explain, she said. I explained. I walked her through the Galthrak. Operation as Sithara, and I had mapped it. The slow burn strategy, the funding. Networks, the intended response, the military crackdown that would produce the narrative they needed, and the alternative, a response built on the principle that you win a disinformation campaign not by fighting it with force, but by removing the surface it needs to grow on. The Galthrek are expecting a reaction they can point to, I said. A fleet movement and occupation of Vetheran, something that looks to the outside like dominance exercised over a weaker partner. We do not give them that. Instead, we give the local council on Vetheran something visible and useful: infrastructure support, a direct economic agreement, a seat at a compact trade table they have been excluded from for 40 years. We make the relationship between the Dominion and Vetheran look like exactly what it should be, but rarely is. Two parties with a genuine mutual interest. Vayara was looking at the map on the data tablet. Simultaneously, I continued, we take the intelligence Sithara extracted from the testimony and we bring it quietly to 3 specific members of the Compact Council, the ones whose civilizations are also being worked on by the Galthrak, though they don't know the name for it yet. We don't announce it publicly, we give it to them directly, clearly, with full attribution. We let them see the pattern. They will be angry, Sithara said. Yes, I said, which is exactly what we want. Angry Compact members who have been quietly manipulated are a very different problem for the Galthrak than a Dominion military response. They cannot manage 9 separate civilizations simultaneously demanding accountability. They can manage one. Kreth had moved at some point and was now standing closer to the desk, looking at the map over my shoulder. The Galthrak will know we have the intelligence, he said. Eventually, I said, by which time the narrative they were building will have already been exposed as manufactured. The window they needed, the story that the Dominion mistreats its members, will be closed. You cannot close it with force. You can only close it by making it obviously false. The room was quiet. Again, Thayara set the data tablet down. She looked at the chessboard on the side table for a moment, just a glance, but I caught it. You have done this before, she said, at a smaller scale perhaps. But this pattern of response, this is not something you developed in the last 14 hours. No, I said, I have been in a version of this situation before. Different geography, different actors. The underlying shape is familiar. What shape? I thought about how to say it. Simply, someone bigger than you, I said, tries to use your response against you. They want you to hit back. They have set up the whole situation so that hitting back is the logical, obvious, emotionally satisfying thing to do, and it will hurt you. The only answer is to not be the person they have planned for to be something they have not modeled. Thayara looked at me for a long moment. Teach me, she said. It was the same word she had used over the chessboard weeks ago, but it meant something different now. It covered more ground, chess or everything else. I said both, she said. There was no dramatic pause after that, no ceremony. She pulled the data tablet back in front of her and began asking questions, specific, operably focused questions, and I answered them. And Sulara took notes, and Kreth occasionally added tactical observations with the particular quality of a man who has realized very recently that the category of useful intelligence is broader than he previously thought. We worked until the station moved into its dark cycle. I went back to our quarters and stood at the viewport for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, watching the rings of the gas giant turn in the dark, the amber and rust color, the impossible patience of something that large moving that. Slowly, the door opened and Viager came in. She stood at the viewport beside me, which she had started doing without announcement, without explanation, without needing either. The chessboard is here, I said. I moved it, she said. I noticed she was quiet for a moment. It is easier to think in this room, she said. The briefing rooms are designed for consensus. I do not always want consensus. What do you want in here? I asked. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I stopped waiting for the answer and just looked at the rings to understand the board correctly. She said finally, the whole board, not just the pieces that are visible. I looked at her profile in the viewport's light, the clean line of her jaw plating, the way her eyes caught the ring's amber color and held it. That, I said, is the whole game. She did not answer. We stood at the viewport in the quiet dark, and neither of us moved for a long time, and below us the planet turned with the deep and steady patience of something that has seen a very great many things come and go and was in no particular hurry. In the morning we would begin, not with armies, not with fleets, with something older and harder, and in the end more difficult to stop, with the simple, patient, thoroughly human act of thinking 7 moves ahead.